I wanted to make this video today because I honestly find it so fascinating to ask people their reasons for wanting to have kids and not wanting to have kids, and people are always fascinated why I don't want to have children someday, because I guess it's still seen as quite a taboo in our culture. But I'm not making this video to try and convince anyone to have children or not to have children. I am deeply in awe of parents, and I think it's such an important job that so many people are doing in raising the future generations. And I really hope this video can be interesting to anyone, regardless of whether you do want kids or don't want kids, because I'm going to be talking about the ways in which motherhood is constructed as oppressive in our current society, and also some of the social and political issues around parenthood in general. Before I jump into the video, I just wanted to make clear that I'm coming at this conversation from a white, cis, able-bodied perspective, and when I talk about the concepts of motherhood and womanhood, I'm mostly referring to the white, cis, het social construct of these things, and I've tried to be as inclusive as possible throughout the video, but I'm mostly talking about my own personal experience, so I've left a bunch of resources in the description box of people from more marginalised groups talking about their experiences with and their thoughts around parenthood for anyone looking for more of that perspective. I really dislike the way in which this ideal of the perfect mother in Western culture is constructed in a way where to be the perfect mother, you're supposed to be constantly self-sacrificing, self-annihilative, constantly getting rid of any pleasures in your life, giving up on your hopes and dreams and aspirations and fantasies for your life, and essentially giving everything up, renouncing everything about yourself that is your individual, unique personality and things that bring you joy for your child. So to me, motherhood seems to be linked implicitly to suffering. I really loved the book of Woman Born by Adrienne because she talks about her own experiences of motherhood and how much of herself she had to sacrifice in order to be a mother. And she talks about this thing called the female fate, where she says, "Denying every active, powerful aspect of myself, I became disassociated both from my immediate present bodily experience and from my reading, thinking, writing life. I committed myself to a profound inner boredom." Another thing I hate about the construction of ideal womanhood is that it's very white, heterosexual, middle class, able-bodied. If you don't fit that very specific mold, then you're not considered to be a good mother. Trying to conform to being a good mother is usually also associated with trying to get your child to conform to the interests of our current state, our current system. So you're supposed to be good at gendering your sons to be good patriarchs. You're supposed to be great at making the girls be ladylike and sweet and kind and empathetic, and you're supposed to get them to be good cogs in the machine, to work hard and be productive. And I just think that if I were to have children, I would want to raise them completely outside of these oppressive structures. I'd want to raise them to be genderless. I'd want to raise them to challenge and be critical of the way in which our current system functions. I'd want to raise them with completely different values. And the work it would take to try and do that would be extremely exhausting. And I would also find it so difficult to try and work against the education system, work against all the indoctrination from advertisements and consumerist society in general. And it just sounds exhausting, honestly. Parents, but mothers in particular, are now supposed to have it all, but having it all just means doing everything. You're supposed to still do the bulk of the domestic labour and the emotional labour, but you're also supposed to have a job, but you're also supposed to do all these extracurricular activities with your kids, and you're supposed to have the ideal body and cook the most amazing nutritional meals all the time. Feminists have talked about this as the double burden, where we attempted to get women to be able to have access to the workforce, But instead of them being liberated to work, they now have the double burden of not only working, but also doing the bulk of the domestic and emotional labour at home still. So instead of being more free, we now have more on our plate than ever before. And I think this has really translated into parenthood as well. And in the past, they used to have this idea of the Madonna-like virginal purity of mothers, but now you're supposed to be a hot mama or a MILF. You're supposed to have impossible standards of your body after you have a child. And these impossible expectations means that you're going to be ridiculed no matter what decision that you make as a parent. So if you go out to work, then you're not spending enough time with your children. But if you stay at home with your children, then you're not modeling a good work ethic for your future kids to thrive at work. And there's so many criticisms about breast milk versus bottle feeding and attachment parenting versus letting them cry it out. And if you have one child, you're selfish because the child needs siblings. But if you have 3 kids, that's too much because you don't have enough time for each of them. So it just seems like no matter what you do, you're always doing something wrong. And because parents are constantly made to feel inadequate, these marketing companies then latch onto that and tell you all these things that you're supposed to consume, supposed to buy in order to become the perfect parent. Now they have all these extra commodities that they sell for ridiculous prices that basically feed off of the insecurities of parents, and no one wants to be a bad parent, so everyone then buys into it. The social construct of the good mother and the bad mother completely removes all of the responsibility from the state or the structure in our society for the ways in which our children turn out, and instead put all of the responsibility on us as individuals. We see this a lot with these shows like Super Nanny, where an external person comes into your home and it scolds the parents for being bad parents and teaches them the way in which to raise their own children, which just reinforces that all of the onus is on the parents for the fact that their kids aren't doing that great. I read a really interesting book by Eliane Glaser called Motherhood, a Manifesto, and in it she really debunks this personal responsibility rhetoric when it comes to raising kids, because she talks about the ways in which income and education are actually the 2 most important factors that will contribute to a child's life chances. It's not so much to do with the parents themselves, it's more about how much are they earning and how much access does a child have to good education. But if we're only ever talking about this in terms of how much are we conforming to a perfect parent, then it removes the conversations around what is the state doing to combat inequality, to combat poverty, to make sure that parents are able to give their children the best life chances possible. Today there are so many mummy vloggers and bloggers around who will be more honest about the experiences of parenthood, but a lot of the time it's very much reinforcing this meritocratic, overcoming hardship type of narrative. They'll talk about some of the struggles, but then they'll say, yeah, it was hard, but then I worked hard and I pulled myself together and I took personal responsibility and now the reward is so amazing. And again, I think it contributes to this idea that all parents need to do is work super hard, take responsibility, and then they'll become super amazing parents. And all of it just removes conversations around why does it have to be this hard? Why does it have to be such a struggle? And why can't we have systems in place, safety nets in place to make it easier for people to be able to raise their children? I remember I used to find it so fascinating when I would take my younger brother to school, who's 10 years younger than me, and all of these parents would be talking amongst each other, about each other, shaming each other and ridiculing each other for their parenting styles. And I honestly think all of this was all of them just projecting because they themselves were so exhausted from feeling all of this responsibility, these impossible expectations, from not feeling that they lived up to this image of the ideal mother. And so instead of confronting those feelings, I think they felt the need to project outwards onto other parents how terrible they all were, because secretly they themselves were feeling like terrible parents. And I think it's so sad that there isn't that solidarity amongst parents. Instead, everyone's kind of fighting to the death not to be vilified, not to be the one that's rejected or labelled as the bad mother. So instead, they're putting that label of bad parent onto other people. Caring for children is so incredibly individualized in Western culture. In many other cultures, it's much more of a communal endeavor. We've all heard the saying that it takes a village to raise a child, but nowadays it's seen as just two people who have to do everything, and we're often so atomized from the community, from friends, from family, that we don't have anyone to help us out. And this is a really big reason why I don't want to have kids, because I already feel like it's so hard for me to juggle everything in life and still have enough time for joy and time for rest. And I just think if I had a child on top of that, I would never have a single moment free. I honestly do not know how parents do it, because if I'm already struggling, how on earth do people with parents manage it all? It honestly blows my mind. So again, just massive kudos to anyone with children. Another reason I don't want to have kids one day is because of the gender gap in the tasks that are completed in a cis heterosexual parenting situation. And there's definitely been some progress that's been made from the past in terms of equality in gender roles when it comes to parenting, but still not enough for me to feel comfortable to choose to be a parent in that kind of relationship dynamic. And I definitely could have children with non-men since I am bisexual, but honestly I'm so inculcated with this image of this nuclear family that I still need to dismantle, that it's hard for me to imagine having children outside of that context. But like I said, that's work that I need to do on myself. But when it comes to men, I still think that I wouldn't really be able to trust many men. First of all, because I think the majority of them haven't done much work on themselves to dismantle so much of the toxic conditioning that they have received. I think I would honestly feel afraid that as soon as I was damaged goods from having had a child, that they would run off with some younger model, some younger version of myself. And maybe I need to just learn to be more trusting in these contexts, but I'm also just so aware of the patriarchy, and so I don't have that much faith when it comes to those kind of relationships. And I'd also be really afraid as well of the kind of toxic messaging that they may instill into our children, because if they're so inculcated with the patriarchy, I'd assume that they would send the same messages to our kids, which I'd obviously not want to happen. In recent years, there's been a lot of studies that have shown that relationship satisfaction markedly declines after you have children in a partnership. And I think there's many reasons for this, some of which I'm going to get into later on. But I definitely think for me personally, I could imagine myself building up a lot of resentment in my relationship if I felt like I had to give up so much more of myself and my career and my aspirations in order to raise the child. And also, it really bothers me when a man's role in the child's life isn't seen as essential, but more seen as help, seen as an act of generosity. Like I'm supposed to be grateful that they're helping me out with our children. And I can just imagine so much of this being so difficult to navigate, trying to raise children without so much of the patriarchy coming into the dynamic would be extremely difficult in our current system. And I am incredibly hopeful as a person, so I do have hope that I could cultivate a relationship like that, but I don't know. I just don't know if that's actually going to happen. The female body has been both territory and machine, virgin wilderness to be exploited, and assembly line turning out life. When I learnt that maternal instinct was actually a social construct and there's no scientific evidence that something like a maternal instinct actually exists, it really blew my mind. And realizing that it was constructed as a way to keep people with wombs reproducing, it really put into context so much of the messaging that we get around how it's so important for us to reproduce, that that is the most meaningful and fulfilling thing that you can do in your life. And it just really transformed my whole perspective on whether or not I should have kids, because before that I used to think that there was something wrong with me for not having this so-called instinct. Whenever I tell people that I don't want to have kids, I often feel the need to present myself as loving and nurturing and caring in other ways and point to other ways in which I'm being motherly because there's often this image of the cold-hearted, witchy, barren woman who doesn't want to have kids, like there's something inherently wrong with you. So the maternal instinct was originally constructed during the Industrial Revolution. So at that time, essentially, the economy needed more children to fuel the labour force, and it needed women to remain in the domestic sphere of the home. So the idea of maternal instinct was constructed to enculture women into craving motherhood. Silvia Federici, in the book Caliban and the Witch, said, "The human body, and not the steam engine, and not even the clock, was the first machine developed by capitalism." When I started to recognize that even my womb was seen as a machine to be used by capitalists, it's definitely very interesting, to say the least. And it really got me thinking about the ways in which this concept of maternal instinct is still used to enculture us into believing that having children is the most rewarding, fulfilling, incredible thing that we could do, that this is just my instinct, this is the natural state of my being, is to churn out children, and how that serves a political purpose because we have so much of an aging population at the moment. They still need a young labour force. We have so many narratives around white replacement that they still want people like myself to be churning out more white babies, basically. And I'm not saying that I see me not having children as a political stance. I don't in any way see it as political choice. It's just my personal preference. But at the same time, it definitely helped me to dismantle a lot of the messaging I had received that there was something wrong with me for not wanting to have children, because I realized that aspiring to be a perfect mother is essentially about being a perfect employee, and the product you are creating is the grown child. A quote that really stuck with me was by a John Duncan video where he referenced Julie Tehan from Working Mother. "If I could go back in time, I would announce my pregnancy with a sign taped to my belly that said, 'I'm creating demand. From a business perspective, I am supply and the demand. I am supplying a person who will one day generate demand. Instead of the gift-wrapped baby shoes I gave my husband, I would wrap up a wad of cash to show my boss how I was helping to drive the economy and pay into the pension system. Or perhaps I'd announce it with a teeny tiny briefcase to highlight the potential future business leader I was carrying.'" And that quote is just like, oof. The fact that being a woman is associated with giving birth and having a maternal instinct is also incredibly transphobic, and it's harmful to people who are wanting to have children outside of a heterosexual nuclear family context. And all of this anti-abortion legislation also needs to be understood in this context where the state is wanting to keep certain bodies reproducing, so they're making it more and more difficult for us to not reproduce when we don't want to. But as Angela Davis pointed out in Racism, Birth Control and Reproductive Rights, it's only certain bodies that the state wants to see reproducing. So this pressure for more people to have children often existed alongside the forced sterilization of poor women and black women in particular. The state wants to keep certain bodies reproducing for political and economic purposes. I also think the idea of the maternal instinct is used as a way to silence mothers from talking about the struggles of raising children, because it's all supposed to come so naturally and easily and biologically to them, like it's their inherent duty that they were born with. And this is one of the many reasons why choice feminism frustrates me, because we're supposed to be liberated to make whatever choice is best for us to have kids or not have kids. But if we're constantly being encultured to believe that to be a mother is the most fulfilling, rewarding, incredible thing we could do with our lives and it's our inherent purpose, then how much choice do we really feel we have to choose differently in our lives? Parenthood is often used as a way to fill the void within us that is caused by systemic problems. We have a loneliness epidemic. Our lives are so devoid of meaning and joy and love and connection. Our jobs don't bring us satisfaction. So we think that the only way to have meaning and fulfillment in our lives is through having children. And I think this is especially the case for women, because as soon as we get to the age of 30 or 40, we're seen as completely invisible, we're unwanted, undesired, going to be replaced by younger versions of ourselves. So we think the only way to make ourselves visible is through having children. And recognizing this has definitely contributed to me not wanting to have children, because one, I don't want to put that kind of pressure on children to provide all of my fulfillment and joy and love in my life. And secondly, I want to dedicate a lot of my life to bringing about a different kind of society where we don't need to rely on children as the only mechanism through which we can experience that kind of love and joy and meaning in our lives. I don't want to ever feel as if I'm socially coerced into having a child. I want to have a child if I deeply, deeply long to have a child, and so far I've never had such a longing. Another reason I don't want to have children is because I would be very afraid that I'd end up regretting having them. And people always say that if you don't have children, you'll end up regretting it. But regretting having children is very much a real phenomenon. It's just never really talked about, because to say that you regret having children is such a taboo in our culture. But if you go on sites like I Regret Having Kids, which is a Facebook group, or if you scroll on Reddit, or if you look at the book Regretting Motherhood, there are many stories of people who regret becoming parents. When I used to work as a carer, I used to speak a lot to older people, and it was common for me to come across older women who would say, I don't regret having kids, but if I had my time again, I wouldn't choose to have children. Or they'd say things like, I love my children, but I just hate motherhood. I don't like being a mother. And I think it's so important that we're more open as a culture about the possibility of regret when it comes to children, because otherwise people go into the decision of having a child very lightly, thinking that regret could never be a possibility. I don't think that regret should be seen as cold-blooded or heartless. I think it's just an emotion that some people experience and some people don't in this context. And regretting parenthood doesn't necessarily mean that you are a bad parent. It just means that you're rationalizing the situation that you're in and coming to the conclusion that it wasn't quite for you. So yes, for me, regretting having children is definitely something that I think about, and definitely something that puts me off of making the decision, because I'd rather regret not having children than regret having children. There have been so many parents who seem to be so incredible and do absolutely everything right, and then their children turn out to somehow just be little devil children, and I find it really hard, because I think, wow, you can dedicate all this time, you can dedicate all this energy, and still your child turns out like that. And obviously you never really know the full situation of what the parents were actually like behind closed doors, or what other factors played into this child turning out this way. I don't want to pathologize certain people as inherently evil, because I don't think anyone is inherently evil, but at the same time I've personally seen so many parents struggle with the fact that they were unable to raise children that were at the bare minimum, like just kind. I think a lot of people have this romanticized image of imparting wisdom on your child and having this amazing connection and shared values and ideas and whatever with this child. But I once watched this documentary, and in it there was this phrase that has stuck with me ever since, where they said, parents don't raise children, corporations raise children. And I think that's so true when we think about advertisements and internet access and so many other things that can really shape how your child turns out. I think it's so hard to raise children with great values in our current culture, and I would find it really difficult to accept my child if they were, for example, incredibly right-wing or had fascistic ideas and things like that. And you're supposed to accept your child no matter what, but I feel like I have very set ideas of what I would want my child what values I would want my child to have, and if they didn't have those, I would be very disappointed. And I think that that doesn't lend itself to being a very good parent. I've often said that if I lived in a different culture, if I lived in a more liberated setting, I would be much more inclined to have children, but as it currently stands, I can't see it happening. I also read in the book The Will to Change by Bell Hooks, she gave this example of a friend of hers who had tried to raise their son to be non-patriarchal, and then in the end the child turned out to be incredibly patriarchal. And I also found this with my younger brother. I've tried very hard to talk to him a lot about leftist values, and I have just found that so much of the hard work that I put into that relationship seems to have gone down the drain ever since he's got this job where he's surrounded by these incredibly patriarchal men. I think this is one thing that I think about in particular because I've had many conversations with my grandma, who is incredibly disappointed with the way that my auntie treats my grandma, because my auntie is not very nice to my grandma. And I've also had conversations with my other grandma about how she thinks her relationship with her daughter is, and she's disappointed in her daughter, and that must be so difficult to deal with when you've spent so much time and energy dedicated to raising your child and then they end up treating you terribly. And it just reinforced to me the idea that I don't want to take that chance, basically. The planet and climate change is definitely another reason why I'm so afraid to have children, and it's got nothing to do with overpopulation. Mexi made incredible videos about the myth of overpopulation. It's mostly because I have a lot of eco-grief for what is happening to our planet, and I think I would find it so difficult to bring a child into the world and be constantly afraid of what their future might hold. Would they have access to water? Would they have access to food? What wars will spring out, what fascism could come about because of the current climate situation. And I think that that level of fear would just be so debilitating that I think it really puts me off of wanting to have a child. And it's not that I'm hopeless or nihilistic. I made a whole video about hope, and I want to make a video about eco-grief because I'm really doing a lot around my eco-grief to improve how I feel when it comes to the world around me, and I think I'd love to share a lot of my thoughts around that. But at the same time, I think it definitely impacts my decision to have children, because I wouldn't want to bring a child into the world and be afraid constantly about what potential future lies ahead of them. I've often had this sense that there are already so many people suffering in this world, and I wouldn't want all of my time and energy and compassion and love to be taken up by just one child, by one being. I'd want to use all of that time and energy and love for lots of other people. And I think when you have children, because of the level of dedication it takes, I think that often detracts from the amount of time and energy you have for other causes or other things that you care about in the world. All of that being said, I could see the possibility of me potentially fostering or adopting someday. I definitely would love to adopt rescued animals someday, but all of these things are very far off ideas, and still I have hesitations around those things as well. But it's definitely something that I would consider. For the most part, when I look at the vision I have for the future of my life, I can't really see children coming into that. I love the idea of having a home that might be open for people who might need it, who are homeless, who are refugees. I like the idea of doing a lot of work in my community. I like the idea of writing books. I like the idea of spending my days walking in nature and maybe living in a cottage in the middle of nowhere. And when I have a vision of my life, I don't really see children in the picture. I do think it's important, as with any decisions in life, to look at the downsides of the decisions that we do want to make. And I do think that not having children does come with its downsides. Like, I do think there is a level of deep emotional love that you can only really access if you have a child. I have this incredible emotional bond with my younger brother because of the age gap. I definitely feel a more motherly type of love for him, And I do think that the type of bond you could have with a child would be so incredible. I sometimes have this image of what my child could look like and what they could be like, and I sometimes feel as if I'm killing this hypothetical image of my child by not having that child, because the child already seems so real in some ways. I don't know if anyone else has experienced anything like that before, but it's definitely a strange feeling. I also love the way that Sheila Heti put it in her book Motherhood, where she said, "There is a great sadness in not wanting the things that give other people their life's meaning." And I think there is a lot of truth to that, because so often when my friends talk about how all they ever want in life is to have children, and that is the most important, amazing thing they could ever do, it's sad to not want the things that they want, and sometimes I do wish that I wanted those things. And I imagine, especially for people as they get older, as more and more of my friends start to have children, it will probably be kind of an isolating experience to be one of the only ones that doesn't have children, because I guess it's still not the norm. I would love to hear in the comments if you have experience of being one of these people who is completely outside of the norm of what everyone else is doing, and how you manage to deal with that. Something that's really helped me when thinking about the downsides of not having children is this chapter of Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed, where she references this poem called The Blue House by Thomas Transformer. In the poem, he's standing far away from his own home, and he's looking at his home and he's observing all the lives he could have led had he made other choices in life. And he says that, "I am grateful for this life, and yet I miss the alternatives. All sketches wish to be real. Every life has a sister ship, one that follows quite another route than the one we ended up taking. The people we may have been live a different phantom life than the people we are." There's always going to be a sister ship, there's always going to be a life we could have led had we made other choices. Every choice that we make contains some loss, and I think it's really important to give ourselves the permission to mourn the lives that we could have led had we made other choices, even if we're happy with the choices that we made. Thinking about this video has been so interesting for me, because it made me realise how so many of the reasons why I don't want to have kids has to do with systemic issues like patriarchy, like the gender binary, like capitalism, and it just reinforced to me just how much work we need to do to dismantle these things, because we're making parenthood so unnecessarily difficult for so many people. And I think it's very suspicious that the media gravitates towards feminist issues that have to do with sex, like the Me Too movement, that have to do with younger women, whereas when it comes to issues like motherhood and the struggles of raising children under this current system, we rarely ever hear about these people's experiences. I would love so much to hear from parents what your experience has been of parenthood. I would love to hear from people, if you do want kids, why you want kids, if you don't want kids, why you don't want kids, if you are open to sharing. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me, and if you could consider becoming a patron, as it really helps me to continue to make videos. Thank you so much to my current patrons for helping to support this channel. It really means the world to me, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Bye!